So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grand Rounds, our virtual Grand Rounds. Today is an award named Grand Rounds presentation in honor of Dr. Robert Spitzer. Michael First was very closely with Bob over the years, will be making the introduction. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements before about what else COVID. So we're in a situation now which is good and bad. The vaccines are on the way, but the next 3 months are going to be extremely bad. Not just bad for us like they were in March and April and May when we had the surge, but for the whole country. But even though our infection rate is way lower than it was in the spring, it's been rising incrementally, consistently for the past 8 weeks, and will continue to be over the holiday period. So nobody wants to be the last person killed in the war. So you have to follow safety precautions very strictly, and things will be better by March. In terms of the vaccines, the expectation after the FDA meets on December 10th and 11th is that they'll the next day be rolled out for distribution, and they're going to the states, which then distribute to them to the health systems and the health providers, which then can administer them based on the guidelines that the CDC put out, but are then interpreted and adapted by each state. So each state adapts them for their own purposes. Now, New York State has decided that the phase 1A is going to be healthcare workers and nursing home, congregant living nursing home residents. Healthcare workers means everybody, but it's going to be stratified in terms of sequence. First, there'll be ED and ICU, but then eventually all healthcare workers. We're not sure if the vaccine is going to be mandated or voluntary, but everybody should get it regardless. In terms of supply, this is the first tranche is going to come from Pfizer and Moderna, which have the mRNA vaccine. It's safe, it's highly effective, no reason not to get it. The first tranche of supply will be 2/3 of it will come from Pfizer, 1/3 from Moderna. Globally or nationally, they have 40 million doses. Of course, each person gets vaccinated with 4 weeks apart, 2 injections. There's 24 million healthcare workers in the United States, so 40 million doses should cover it, but you never know. And in New York is expecting to get 1 million doses, and there's 180,000 healthcare workers in New York State. So we should be covered with it. Where we are in the queue is not clear. And our sources of the vaccine will come through NYP and through OMH. NYP has been very clear about how they're going to do it. OMH less so, but we have 2 shots on goal in that respect. So the news is get vaccinated as soon as we can, but in addition, absolutely follow the restrictions with masks, with distancing, with no gathering with significant numbers of people. Our hospital now has 1,000 people, staff persons who are sick. And that's from just things of hanging out together, eating together. We have to take off your masks. So this is still an ongoing threat, but we're in the final stages of it. And as I said, you don't want to be the last person that gets hit as a result of this when the end is near. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael First to introduce our speaker.
Okay, before I do that, this is the Bob Spitzer Memorial Grand Rounds. These Grand Rounds, this I believe is the 6th one, and they've all had to do with a topic that would be near and dear to Bob's heart, having to do with psychiatric diagnosis. And I'm sure this one in particular, having to do with the Rosenhan study, would be especially of interest to him. And I think I'm really looking forward to hearing the real story behind the Rosenhan article and the whole business. I always like to start by, for those in the audience who really are not that familiar or don't know that much about Bob Spitzer, let me give a brief kind of bio. So Bob received his bachelor's degree in psychology from Cornell in 1953 and his medical degree from NYU School of Medicine in 1957. He completed his psychiatric residency at Psychiatric Institute in 1961 and graduated from Columbia's Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research in 1966, a fact that many people find surprising given his eventual antipathy towards psychoanalysis. Dr. Spitzer completed his psychiatric residency at Columbia and was a member of the faculty of the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and the Biometrics Research Department at the New York State Psychiatric Institute for over half a century. He retired from Columbia University in 2003. The seminal achievement of Bob's career was the establishment of a psychiatric diagnostic system that was empirically based on uniform standards. Psychiatry was in a crisis of credibility in the mid-1970s when Bob Spitzer was asked to oversee an update of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Two studies published in the early 1970s shook the medical community's confidence in psychiatric diagnosis. In 1972, researchers compared diagnostic practices among clinicians in New York and London and found that the same patients who were diagnosed as having schizophrenia in New York were diagnosed as having manic depressive disorder in London. And Bob Spitzer was actually a member of the steering committee for that study. The following year, and very relevant to today's presentation, Daniel Rosenhan published a controversial paper in Science describing how 8 pseudo patients were admitted to psychiatric wards for an average of 19 days despite behaving as normal after a single initial claim of hearing a voice. Bob wrote a scathing critique of Rosenhan's experiment, a careful examination of the study's methods, results, and conclusions leads me to a diagnosis of logic in remission, but recognized that both reliability and validity of psychiatric diagnosis were rightfully being questioned. Bob has devoted his early research career to developing questionnaires and interviews to measure psychopathology, culminating in the development in 1978 with the research diagnostic criteria, which were a precursor to the DSM, and its companion interview, the Schedule for Affective Disorders and Schizophrenia. Bob's exceptional intellectual, organizational, editorial, and political skills were put to the test in the production of the DSM-3, which required the development of operationalized criteria for every disorder in psychiatry in the face of opposition by the then prevailing psychoanalytic community. A field trial which demonstrated that clinicians could use the DSM-3 diagnostic criteria to achieve good diagnostic reliability resulted in its widespread acceptance by both researchers and mental health practitioners in the United States and internationally. Among the new diagnoses championed by Bob Spitzer as part of the DSM-3 process was post-traumatic stress disorder, which was added in part as a response to the increased recognition of the psychological sequelae of combat exposure among veterans returning from the Vietnam War. Bob also played a major role in having homosexuality removed from the 1974 printing of DSM-2. After meeting with gay rights advocates in the early 1970s, he began re-examining homosexuality based on whether it caused any measurable distress. The issue was extremely contentious, but in 1973, he engineered a deal by which the diagnosis was replaced by, quote, sexual orientation disturbance, unquote, to describe people whose sexual orientation, gay or straight, caused them distress, making it clear that sexual orientation in and of itself was not the grounds for a diagnosis of a mental disorder, paving the way for the eventual societal acceptance of homosexuality as a normal variation. Other achievements included developing the structured clinical interview for DSM, the SCID, which has become the most widely used structured diagnostic interview instrument for research, and the patient health questionnaire, PRIME-MD, that is now widely used in primary care medicine for the screening and diagnosis of depression and for monitoring response to treatment. So today we're very, very lucky to have Susannah Cahalan with us to tell us about her exploration and detective work on getting to the inside of the very famous Rosenhan study. So Susannah did her undergraduate work in English literature in Washington University in St. Louis. And from 2007 until 2016, she was first a reporter and then a features editor at the New York Post. Susannah Cahalan is an award-winning #1 New York Times bestselling author. Her first book, Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness, a memoir about her struggles with MDA encephalitis, came out in 2012 and has sold over 1 million copies. It was made into a film, which was co-produced by Susannah and Charisse Theron, starring Chloe Grace Moretz, and was released on Netflix in 2018. Her newest book, The Great Pretender, The Undercover Mission That Changed Our Understanding of Madness, was published in 2019. It describes her investigation of the famous, or should I say infamous, Rosenhan study on being sane in insane places, which was an attack on the legitimacy of psychiatric diagnosis. The book was shortlisted for the Royal Society's 2020 Science Book Prize. So with that introduction, let's have Susannah tell us the story of Rosenhan and this very interesting and influential study. Thank you very much, Susannah.
Thank you, Michael. All right, I'm going to share my screen so that I can do my PowerPoint here. So give me a second while I get this going. So I just want to say that this is really special for me to be here. I actually was in the audience at the inaugural memorial lectures, Robert Spitzer Memorial Lecture. And I was sitting in the audience and so enthralled by the minds on stage talking about Bob Spitzer and about the work that he's done in psychiatry and medicine in general. And I could never, ever have imagined that I would be on stage, or not on stage, but theoretically on stage. And so I'm just so grateful. Specifically, thank you, Dr. First. I so appreciate you inviting me, and to Janet Williams as well. Thank you again so much for your support and for inviting me. It means a lot to me. And I want to think that if Robert Spitzer was in the audience right now, he would be laughing about this. So I think there's a lot here. There's to laugh about. I think hopefully there's some kind of comedic element to this. It's also an investigation, and it also has very serious ramifications. So what I'm going to be doing in this is kind of bringing you through my investigation as it happened into this famous study on being sane in insane places that Dr. First mentioned in his quick bio of Bob Spitzer. So I have this quote that I think is kind of a great way of encapsulating what I feel reporting should do. The best reporting tries to capture the most attainable version of the truth with clarity and humility about what we don't know. I think the key part of that this sentence is phrase is humility. And there's a lot I don't know still about this study on being sane in insane places that I'm about to talk about. What I'm going to present to you is my version of the truth that I'd spent 6 years trying to attain. So I'm going to start with my foils. I can't think of kind of two more different men to kind of anchor this narrative. So we have David Rosenhan, Stanford psychologist, kind of flitted around various topics. His early interest was in altruism in children. He studied altruism in children. He wrote abnormal psychology textbooks. Later on, he would kind of jump around from topic to topic, such as dreams in the aftermath of natural disasters. He studied freedom fighters. So there's a kind of not one through line to the work, but the most famous piece that he was a part of, which became a classic in the history of psychiatric literature, is a study on being sane in insane places. And as Dr. First described, it involved 8 people going undercover in psychiatric hospitals around the country. All of the participants were misdiagnosed with serious mental illness. It caused, during a time of very heightened vulnerability, it caused one of the major causes of an identity crisis in psychiatry. This study is taught in the majority of Psych 101 classes still today, and is in almost every single history of psychiatry, modern history of psychiatry, this study will show up in some form. A kind of little anecdote about David Rosenhan that I think is good, a good way of kind of separating them as well, is when he was a kid, he was a guidance counselor, a camp counselor at an upstate camp. And he was the kind of counselor that would soothe the homesick kids by telling them stories. He'd make up stories to tell them to make them feel better. And he got the nickname among his family members and colleagues of the storyteller. Now, Bob Spitzer is a very different person. He's always been, I think people would say, always been very, very interested, highly interested in psychiatric diagnosis. And his whole career really revolves around that issue. I think you could call him extremely centered, extremely numbers oriented. He's most famous, obviously, for being the architect of the DSM-3, and his work pulled the field away from a more psychodynamic approach to a more descriptive one. And it really cemented psychiatry's place in the field of medicine. Now, a kind of ancillary story in response to David Rosenhan, when Bob Spitzer went to camp as a kid and couldn't have been 10 years old, he actually developed a rating scale, a hotness rating scale for his fellow female campers, which he's so always interested in classification, always interested in numbers. Two very different people. And Janet Williams, Bob Spitzer's wife, described him as the truth seeker. The truth seeker. So we have the storyteller and the truth seeker. Two people who probably would never have much in common at all, but they do have a lot in common. And I'm not going to play this audio. I have audio here of Dr. First describing the Rosenhan study. But what I found so funny when I was sitting in the audience in 2016 during the inaugural lecture with Ken Kendler, who's pictured here, and Janet Williams, Dr. First introduced Bob Spitzer and the storied career, as you just heard. I mean, he's one of the lions, the foundational members of modern psychiatry. Still, David Rosenhan manages to worm his way into Bob Spitzer's biography. And I think it shows how much of how big this study loomed in Spitzer's own world. In fact, according to friends and colleagues, the paper that he wrote in response to David Rosenhan's paper on pseudoscience and science, which it was called, was his favorite paper. And in fact, he wrote 3 papers in total about the Rosenhan study on pseudoscience and science, more on pseudoscience and science in response to a David Rosenhan response to his paper. And then later, he actually took Lauren Slater, a psychologist and a writer who claimed to have did Rosenhan's study again. He actually took her to task with some issues with her validity as well. So he has kind of circled this paper. He did circle this paper many times in his career, and I think he cared deeply about it. Who am I, and why do I have this interest in these studies and the DSM and Robert Spitzer and David Rosenhan's study on being sane in insane places? Well, a little background about me. In 2009, I had my first experience with psychosis, and that happened very swiftly when I was 24 years old. It was almost as if one day I was a fairly normal kind of beginning journalist, reporter at the New York Post, covering all manners of strange stories, going undercover, following around celebrities. And the next day I was hallucinating, I was psychotic, I was hostile and angry and paranoid, and I was hallucinating. And so that descent I chronicle in my book, Brain on Fire. I was in the hospital at NYU Medical Center for 1 month, where I deteriorated into catatonia, and eventually, after that month, was diagnosed with a newly discovered form of autoimmune disease called NMDA receptor autoimmune encephalitis. This was 2009. The disease itself got its name in 2007. The book, I think, begs the question of how many other people have been misdiagnosed, and how many other people continue to be misdiagnosed. When the book came out, it was a surprise success. I did not anticipate the response that the book would create. I was inundated with calls and emails from people all over the world who, in some cases, had received a diagnosis thanks to my book. Doctors and nurses read my book and learned about a new illness that was once seen as exceedingly rare, but now it's still rare, but not as much so. So after I wrote this book, this is some of my medical records if you're interested. at the various points I was misdiagnosed during the height of my psychosis, misdiagnosed with bipolar 1 initially, and then schizoaffective disorder. So after the book was published, I started interfacing very deeply with the psychiatric community. And I started hearing stories of more chronic forms of autoimmune encephalitis, not the same necessarily, maybe the same form that I had, but chronic forms of autoimmune encephalitis that had gone undetected in other people for years. And the assault on the brain so profound that there was no recovery in the same way that I had recovered. And so this begged the question of how are we getting this so wrong? How is psychiatry and the rest of medicine so misdiagnosing to an effect that is seriously harming and maiming people, in some cases killing them? And so it set me off on a quest of really asking, what is the underlying validity of psychiatric diagnosis as it exists today? And one experience for me that really hit these matters home was when I was, I lectured very often after the publication of Brain on Fire, and I would do a lot of grand rounds. And I did a grand rounds at a psychiatric hospital in North Carolina. And after I was done, one of the physicians came up to me and said, we have a woman here who sounds a lot like you, and I think we're going to test her. And I found out 2 weeks later that she had tested positive for the same type of autoimmune disease that I had. But there was a very big difference between the two of us. In her case, she was misdiagnosed for 2 years. In my case, I was misdiagnosed for 1 month. Now, I have recovered fully. I think I can safely say that I have made a full and complete recovery. This woman, the doctors have told me subsequently, will not make a full recovery and will likely live the rest of her life as a quote unquote permanent child. So these questions really kind of plagued me. I mean, as you can imagine, this idea of a mirror image of what could have happened to me so easily had I not been properly diagnosed in the way that I had and treated and aggressively. And if I didn't have the insurance coverage that I had, if I was in another part of the country, that the questions, the kind of layers of what ifs, if I was a different person, if I came from a different background, I could easily have had a very different outcome. And so I was telling this story to Dr. Deborah Levy, who recently passed. She's was a researcher at McLean Hospital, and Dr. Joseph Coyle, who both study schizophrenia. And I was telling them, I was on book tour for Brain on Fire, and I was telling them about these feelings and this mirror image. And at some point, Deborah looked at me and said, "Oh, it's like this, you're like a pseudo patient." And I didn't know what she was talking about. I said, what are you talking about? She said, "Oh, it's like that study on being sane in insane places." And she kind of briefly described that the undercover patients, they all were misdiagnosed. And she's saying, you're kind of like an undercover patient, except you have this, organic illness, and you're kind of testing the nature of psychiatric diagnosis. And so that night I read the article for the first time in a Boston hotel room. And I was just taken with this article. I mean, it's beautifully written, very evocative, just a fascinating piece of work. And I identified so much of my own experiences with my brief misdiagnosis. When I was a psychiatric patient, I was treated differently than when I became an interesting patient with my autoimmune diagnosis. The staff treated me differently. At various points when I got my medical records, I realized that when physicians were looking at me through the eyes of my psychiatric diagnosis, they were seeing different things. For example, my psychiatrist noted that I was wearing a revealing outfit in her write-up of me, and one of her initial write-ups of me. And at that point, the bipolar 1 diagnosis was really being batted around. And I was wearing just a white shirt and leggings, something that I would normally wear. I don't feel is particularly revealing. But since she was looking at me from the bipolar lens, she was thinking hypersexuality. And so she was seeing my physical person through that lens. And this study is many things, and it talks a lot about validity of psychiatric diagnosis. But what really appealed to me and what really kind of rang true to me was this look at the person through a diagnosis and this idea of labeling. And so I found it fascinating. So I decided to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole And I wanted to learn more about what was going on in that time and how much has changed since then, how much hasn't. And so you kind of have to get a sense of what was going on then in the popular culture to understand the crisis that psychiatry was facing then. You had journalistic exposés like Albert Meisel's Bedlam 1946, which eventually became The Shame of the States. You had documentaries like Titicut Follies, which chronicled a Bridgewater, what was called for the criminally insane. And it's, I don't know how many people have seen it. I don't know if it's as required viewing as it has been in the past, though it was banned for many years. It is horrifying. At one point, a patient, a criminal patient, kind of a question mark of what they are, because it's a hospital, it's a forensic hospital essentially, is being force fed by a feeding tube, and the psychiatrist is smoking a cigarette, and the end of the cigarette is just dangling over that feeding tube, and we see this scene, and it's horrific. I mean, the view of psychiatry at the time was sadistic, and people really didn't trust the institution. You also had fictional popular culture, which I think movies like Snake Pit, and I think most profoundly, and which continues to today, right now they're doing Nurse Ratched. They're like kind of doing a new take on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which shows how enduring it is. But in 1962, the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out, and in 1975, the movie came out, and I think really confirmed a lot of the fears that the lay public had about psychiatry. I'm going to play this scene for you quickly here. You're no crazier than the average asshole on the street was a very common belief at the time in the anti-psychiatry movement, which was at its height in the late 60s and early 70s. So you had R.D. Laing, who presented a kind of a theory that schizophrenia was a kind of super sanity, that it was a kind of a sane response to an insane world. On the other side of the spectrum, though they're lumped together, you have Thomas Szasz, who says that mental illness does not exist and that the mentally ill are society's parasites. So you have this kind of view from inside the ranks of psychiatry that things are not as they appear to be, that there's some power dynamic issues, that there's sadism as a core, that hospitals are not therapeutic institutions. This is the popular narrative at the time. Now, in the field, the field is still very much entrenched with Freudian theories, and it seems so in some way prosaic or almost primitive to think about Freud as being the kind of powerhouse that it was at the time. But most people were trained with Freudian theories, and this was still true in the late 60s and early 70s when the study was taking place. We see Shakespeare on the couch now. We know it's relegated mostly to kind of English literature, but at the time it was really part of medical practice. And at the same time, I'd be remiss to say, this was a kind of beginning of the drug revolution in psychiatry. So while you still have Freud, all of a sudden Thorazine hits the market in 1954. And then in 1970, lithium is embraced by the United States. And so now you have a premium on diagnosis. Now it's important that you separate people with schizophrenia from people with what time was called manic depression. Freud had no time for diagnosis. So it became increasingly clear that there's something had to change. What hammered that in, and Dr. First spoke eloquently about this, was the cross-national study of diagnosis, which had a huge effect at the time and was extremely embarrassing to the field and is often lumped together with David Rosenhan's study. In this, videos are taken of patients and in the US and in the UK, psychiatrists are asked to make diagnosis. In the United States, they overwhelmingly diagnose patients with schizophrenia. In the UK, that diagnosis is manic depression, bipolar disorder. So it shows if you're sick in New York, you're going to have a different diagnosis than if you were in London, which shows real issues with reliability, which is a huge problem in diagnosis. You want to make sure that someone in Utah and someone in Maine are going to have the same diagnosis. Into all this comes on being sane in insane places. And I have a little bit of an interview with David Rosenhan that was recorded. Obviously, he had passed away before I started this. Unfortunately, I did not get to interview him directly, but I'm going to play a bit about, so you can hear him from David Rosenhan words, what the study is about.
Dr. Rosenhan, you did a study, and in the study, you got yourself committed to an institution, a mental institution. How did you do this? How did you get them to believe that you were mentally ill, or that you had an emotional problem?
I would rather hope that my friends would think at least that it wasn't easy. But that may be a matter of dispute. What it really amounted to was faking a set of symptoms that had never before been heard of in a psychiatric hospital. And our expectation was that they would catch us right at the door. The symptoms went something like this. I'm hearing voices, which is a common symptom. But usually they ask you, well, what are the voices saying? And in our case, we all said the voices are saying dull, empty, thud. And the reason we chose those symptoms is because anyone who has something of a symbolic orientation will immediately view those voices as some statement about my life. I'm saying that my life now is empty, dull, thud.
So one thing I want to point out before I go into the details of the study, you might have noticed if you read this presentation part here, that there's a discrepancy with the symptoms. In his discussion, he describes in this interview, he described using the word dull, but in the actual study itself, there was no dull. It was thud, empty, and hollow instead of dull. Minor point, but shows you again, every time, as I'm going to go forward, I think I'm kind of gesturing to the fact that things are not as they appear. This is a first example of things not appearing the way that they should. But in general, the study with 8 pseudo patients, 3 women, 5 men, described as an artist, a housewife, a psychiatrist, 4 psychologists, a pediatrician, went undercover in 12 hospitals around the United States, some went in several times. They present with the same symptom that's essential. They all hear a voice that said either dull, as he said, but according to the literature, thud, empty, hollow. The pseudo patients spent anywhere from 7 to 52 days hospitalized. The average length of stay was 19 days. 7 were diagnosed with schizophrenia, 1 with manic depression. 2,100 pills, mostly antipsychotics, were administered, and all left against medical advice with their diagnosis in remission. So I'm going to play, just so you can get a sense of who he is, a little interview with Dave Rosenhan here too.
A different kind of criticism, but one that's just as provocative, has been leveled by David Rosenhan of Stanford University.
Between 1969 and 1972, a group of colleagues and I gained admission to psychiatric hospitals by faking a single symptom, which was that we said that we heard voices, and the voices said empty, dull, thud. The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was no. No one ever did. Admitted with the diagnosis in the main of paranoid schizophrenia, we were discharged with the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in remission. Now, in remission doesn't mean quite the same thing as sane. The term we use to describe the experience is dehumanized. Nobody talks to you. Nobody has any contact with you. The average contact of patients with staff was about 6.5 minutes a day. Nobody comes to visit. The first time I was in a psychiatric hospital, on an admissions ward with 41 men, my wife constituted 4 of the 7 visitors on a weekend. Psychiatric hospitals are storehouses for people in society whom you really don't want, whom you really don't understand, and for whom you've lost a great deal of sympathy.
As you can tell, I mean, he doesn't equivocate there. He's saying psychiatric hospitals are storehouses. in the study itself, he is, as I think hardlined as well. I mean, he concludes in the study, we now know we cannot, as the we here is psychiatrists, we cannot distinguish insanity from sanity. He opens it, can we, if sanity and insanity exist, how shall we know them? He ends it, we don't know them, we can't distinguish them. Now I cannot emphasize how important it was that this study was published in Science. Science, one of the premier generalist journals in the world, gave this study a sense of importance that I think it would not have gotten if it was published in most other places. I mean, you have it published alongside articles such as, earliest radiocarbon dates for domesticated animals, or lunar shapes via the Apollo laser allometer. I mean, these sound very scientific. Now, I don't know if they actually are, but they have this import that I think rubbed off on the study and gave it a credence that perhaps it did not deserve. I mean, I think in this place, he talks about context and diagnosis. This is context and publication. Now, I tried to get the peer review, who peer reviewed it, what the process was, if there was any kind of sharing of data, et cetera. And unfortunately, Science refused. At first, they said they would not give that to me because there's an anonymous process and they protect their sources. Then Dr. Andrew Scull, who is a kind of expert in the history of psychiatry, he reached out to them on my behalf, saying basically, this is part of the historical narrative. We would like to know, what the peer review process is. And they told him that they didn't keep the actual papers from that long ago, which is kind of sad because this is a place where like the Hubble telescope was first described. So I will never know the process and how it was published in Science. I have some, I was able to kind of trace his wanderings during that time. And I know he presented on his experience in a psychiatric hospital at an American Psychiatric Association annual meeting. And I know that one of the editors of Science was there in the audience at the time. So maybe that's how it happened, but I still don't know. But I will say that where it was published and the kind of sensationalistic, conclusions really appealed to the media at the time. So I'm going to kind of show you a bit. I mean, it was over hundreds of articles. He was interviewed all over the place. He became a media darling. So some played it straight. Study finds doctors can't tell the same. Psychiatrists fooled by sham symptoms. Sane or insane is a question some doctors can't answer. I can't see that one because I don't have my little bucket. Oh, 8 faking insanity 8 faking insanity feel hospitals. I don't know it. Full hospitals, yes. You may be normal, but not to a hospital. Stanford Brain says shrinks are all nuts. So it kind of runs the gamut here in terms of tabloid responses and treatment. So the response from the psychiatric community was robust. There were 12 pages of rebuttals and letters of the editor that were published in Science. 3 of those pages were David Rosenhan's own defense of the study, but the rest of the pages were all negative. And he was called out for methodological inadequacies. He was called out for people often doubted that they really only presented with one symptom. People also described his lack of clinical knowledge. They really hit him on that. One person I thought was very smart, and Bob Spitzer really liked it too, was that he said actually they did not behave normally, as you recall from the interview with him. Part of the whole setup here was that once you were hospitalized, you were to behave as normally as possible, which showed that once you were in, you were not to have any more symptoms. So you should have been released. That should have been what happened. But according to one of the responses, the normal way to behave in the situation would be to go up to a nurse or a doctor and say, I'm doing a study And I've gotten in now, and I fooled you guys. So now it's time to let me out because, this is just a study and no one did that. So I kind of like that. But it went on and on and on and on. Just all pages of responses to the study. And then, excuse my fancy PowerPoint. I get very excited about PowerPoint. The piece de resistance, which is Bob Spitzer's On Pseudoscience and Science, Logic and Remission in Psychiatric Diagnosis, a critique of Rosenhan's On Being Sane in Insane Places. I'm just going to read a little bit. I'll just read the first two sentences. Some foods taste delicious, but leave a bad aftertaste. So it is with Rosenhan's study On Being Sane in Insane Places, which by virtue of prestige and wide distribution of science, the journal in which it appeared provoked a furor in the scientific community. And then he, in the abstract up top, Rosenhan's On Being Sane in Insane Places is pseudoscience presented as science. It's just beautiful. I mean, it's probably one of my favorite pieces of academic writing. It's droll, it's funny, it's bitchy. I love this piece so much. And he really takes apart that study. And when I read this, there was a light that went on for me. He describes how the in remission diagnosis is troubling. He says all left with a diagnosed in remission. I think actually 11 of the 12 left with a diagnosis in remission. So it would be schizophrenia, paranoid type in remission. Now, Robert Spitzer went back through the New York State Psychiatric Institution's discharges and found that in the past, I think, few years, there had been not one time that any of the physicians had used the phrase in remission. And to him, he felt that in and of itself showed that the doctors were differentiating, that they were separating sanity from insanity just by dint of calling it in remission, which they never do. He also took apart the use of the words sanity and insanity, which are legal terms. And I think that's a very valid point. He also took on the methodology that Rosenhan used was troubling. And actually, interestingly, I had a graduate student reach out to me recently, and I don't know, statistics are not my strong suit, but she found all these issues with the statistics that Rosenhan used in the piece. So for any of you interested in that, if you can find that Easter egg, it's kind of interesting. He basically said that this study proved nothing beyond the obtuseness of the author. It's a powerful punch, I will say that. So I read this and I thought I need to talk to Robert Spitzer. And so I'd heard that he was having health problems. And so I wrote a letter and crossed my fingers and hoped that I would be able to talk to him because he is the most vociferous, most famous critique, he wrote the most famous critique of the study. And I felt it was essential that I had his voice in whatever story would come. In the meantime, I went to David Rosenhan's archives, which are housed in Stanford, where he was a professor. And there's about 8 bankers' boxes worth of material there. And I also made contact with David Rosenhan's close friend, Florence Keller, a psychologist, who actually had a box filled with papers about On Being Sane in Insane Places. And between those two, I was able to find an unpublished book that David Rosenhan was working on about the study. And I learned that the study actually was born out of, at Swarthmore before he went to Stanford. He was actually recruited to Stanford while he was working on the study. I think that Stanford had learned about what was going on and how big it was going to be. And he actually got a tenure track position in Stanford via this On Being Sane in Insane Places. But he was at Swarthmore before. And the undergraduates, he had an honors class, and they actually were the ones who gave him the idea to go undercover. They wanted to go undercover in psychiatric hospitals. And so that's where the idea was born. I also got access to diary entries that he took during his 11-day stay at Haverford State Hospital in Pennsylvania. He was one of the pseudo patients, involved in this study. The book is so beautiful when it describes his own experiences. it's really evocative. Again, he's a great writer. And almost every single one of the most salient details of the original study actually came from his own personal experiences. So he described in the study a nurse adjusting her bra. That came from his time. He describes how a nurse in the medical records described writing behavior as a pathological sign. That was his time. He describes how an attendant came up to him while he was pacing in front of the cafeteria, and the attendant said, "Nerves." And he makes the point that, no, I was just bored. There's nothing else to do. So everything, again, seen through that clinical diagnosis. And so, almost everything came from this hospitalization at the heart of that paper. Unfortunately, I started to find that things were not making sense. That dull example is one good example of that. I mean, there were some questions that I started to ask the deeper I started to go into the Rosenhan study. One of the major ones was this book. He had about 200 pages written of this book. And he had a major deal with a publisher, Doubleday, a hefty advance. In fact, he was sued to get the advance back when he never published it. Why didn't he publish the book? It was all ready to go. It was there. This would have cemented his place kind of in the kind of canon. Why not publish it? Then there was the fact that he never published on this topic again. He publishes this paper, he publishes a defense paper in response to Robert Spitzer, but he never takes on psychiatric hospitalization ever again. You think you compare him to Robert Spitzer, who's kind of, in a way, like extreme focus on diagnosis really propelled his career. Rosenhan could have studied psychiatric hospitalization for the rest of his life, and it would have been a fruitful career. Instead, he flitted from one topic to another. He was also highly secretive in his private notes about the names of the other pseudo patients, using pseudonyms throughout and changing those pseudonyms and making it very hard to track. Why so secretive? And then I talked to his son, who told me that he hated talking about the study. And then, the reason why I have this wig, which probably is confusing, I haven't told you yet, but this is the kind of kicker to it all. Was I was talking to a friend of his, a professor named Irving Goffman, who's a psychologist, and he described how he was at a dinner party at David's house around the time the study was published. And Rosenhan was kind of, at this point, still talking about the study and regaling everyone with stories from his hospitalization. And at one point, he actually brings everyone up to his closet and shows them this kind of long, scraggly, not a mullet, kind of a joke here, but a long, scraggly wig he claimed to have worn during his hospitalization. I interviewed him. I thought that was funny. I was, what a great little detail. And then I realized there's a picture of him taken of him during his hospitalization, and he has no wig. He's bald. And in fact, the doctors describe him repeatedly as bald. So why lie about a wig? So there's so many questions that are starting to bubble up, and I'm really feeling that Bob Spitzer would provide some great insight. But unfortunately, around Christmas in 2015, on the front page of the New York Times, there was an article about his death. And so I kind of gave up the hope of that happening. A few months later, Janet Williams, his wife, reaches out to me in response to the letter. I guess when she was going through his belongings and his old mail, she found my letter. And so she agreed to get on the phone with me. And she has been a part of the DSM since the origin. So she gave so much insight into the process. And she confirmed to me something that I had long suspected, which I'm going to play a bit from, that Rosenhan and his study hadn't had an effect, had a direct effect on the DSM.
We would write a criterion, for instance, and we would often in the back of our mind would say, okay, if somebody came to a hospital and, declared that they had this symptom, would it make sense? Or would it be like, what did some of Rosenhan's patients have said? Yeah, so we often had that in mind. Did you have were there conversations about that? I mean, was that verbalized? These? Oh yeah. You know, when you write a criterion, really an art criterionating, we used to call it, you had to, you know, write it down and then think every which way to question it, to improve it, so that if someone's going to, you know, not understand that this means this, or is this going to conflict with something else, you know, is this going to be clear? Will the, you know, the psychiatrist on the street be able to read this and know exactly what we mean and agree with us? We were always asking that. So often, you know, the whole Rosenhan thing would come into that, I remember.
So just to hear that confirmed was very exciting to me. And that actually sent me back into the archives. And actually I was able to find some letters between David Rosenhan and Robert Spitzer, and talk about an amazing trove of just two really engaging writers going kind of verbal sparring. I actually couldn't help but think of Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr when they sign off. You know, they're getting increasingly hostile, but they always sign off with "your obedient servant." Bob Spitzer and David Rosenhan had a similar thing where they would get angrier and angrier and angrier, and they would always sign off with "sincerely yours" or "yours sincerely." Janet Williams describes Bob Spitzer's love of controversy here.
He did answer every single letter we got during those years. And we mostly didn't have email, so he would call up the person or he would write them back. And his favorites were the ones that would write him and say, you know, this is terrible, you've got to change this, you can't do this. And when he saw controversy looming, he would fly right into it.
I love that. So excuse my PowerPoint stuff again, but so Spitzer initially reaches out to David Rosenhan while he's working on actually overseeing a series of pieces for the Journal of Normal Psychology, and he's working on his response, Pseudoscience and Science. And so he initially makes contact by asking for some sources for names of hospital for any data information. And David is immediately hostile about that. And you had this back and forth that grows and grows and grows with greater and greater hostility. And then Bob shares a draft of his study with David Rosenhan. And there are two paragraphs that actually are not in the final version, but which really pissed David Rosenhan off. And here they are. Up to now, I've assumed that the pseudo patients did present with only one symptom of psychiatric disorder. Actually, we know very little about the pseudo patients presented themselves. When Rosenhan himself was admitted to Haverford State Hospital, Pennsylvania, February 6, 1969, under the name David Lurie, complaining of voices, the hospital intake and admission notes state the following. The voices were noisy and bothersome. He had left his home. So what you're seeing here is Bob Spitzer is referencing medical records that he was able to get from David's hospitalization. Now, the way he got those medical records was that the actual psychiatrist who misdiagnosed, there was a series of psychiatrists who misdiagnosed him, the kind of attending psychiatrist, Dr. Bartlett, who was a lifelong psychiatrist, a lovely person. I interviewed his family, a person very much devoted to psychiatric care, volunteered for, you know, when he retired as a psychiatrist, he would actually volunteer and help bring people with serious mental illness off the streets into homeless shelters. I mean, one of those kind of real bleeding heart believers. But he misdiagnosed David Rosenhan with having schizophrenia. But he was so upset with the portrayal that he actually sent the medical records to someone named Robert Woodruff, who shared them with, who was actually later be on the DSM task force, and who shared them with Bob Spitzer. So that's how he gets them. Now, I got them too. And what you find is that David Rosenhan's presenting symptoms were not just, I hear a voice that say thud, empty and hollow, which is essential. It's key to the whole piece. They were all supposed to be uniform in the way that they presented. I hear a voice that says thud, empty, hollow. Now here are some of the medical records. And these were repeated again and again and again. So it wasn't just one-off medical records. It was multiple doctors hearing the same thing over and over again. So of course we have the hearing voices. And he tried to insulate them out by putting copper over his ears. He has been unable to work or concentrate. He claims that he was actually medicated, and it's unclear what kind of medication. And then in another entry, it looks like he had actually received a diagnosis in the past. He also describes how David Rosenhan has suicidal ideation. He has thoughts of suicide, as everyone would, quote, be better off if he was not around. Now, this is a far more complicated and robust portrait of psychiatric distress than I hear a voice that says thud, empty, and hollow. Another thing that I found from the medical records was that he tampered with what was actually written in the records versus what he actually published. As you can see, these are side by side. The medical record has none of the Freudian bends that we see in the second, what was actually published in On Being Sane in Sane Places. I mean, look at this considerable ambivalence in close relationships that begins in early childhood, a warm relationship with his mother. There is nothing of this in the actual medical record. So clearly a lot of serious issues here. Now, what happens subsequently after getting very heated to the point where it's basically Rosenhan's basically spitting, and I can kind of imagine Bob Spitzer is like enjoying every moment of it. I can just see it, you know, I think you can just tell the glee, he's enjoying the controversy. But in the end, Rosenhan recruits the superintendent of the hospital to reach out to Spitzer directly. And Spitzer decides in this PS, as you can see where the arrow is, as you realize, I decided to omit references to Haverford State Hospital. What David Rosenhan alleges is that the Haverford State Hospital was a teaching exercise, and that was not included in the actual study itself. The issue with that is that almost the entire study comes from his Haverford State Hospital experiences, almost every single part of it. Every single salient detail comes from his 11 days at Haverford State Hospital. The fact that he would say to Bob Spitzer that it was just a teaching exercise is an outright lie. So why did Bob Spitzer, who knew, I mean, he doesn't know as much as I did because I had access to the unpublished book, but he had the medical records. Why not reveal it? Why not kind of put that coffin nail in this study and put it to rest? Now, I don't know. And again, when I said in the beginning, you know, there's a lot I don't know. This is one thing that I don't know. I have some ideas. I think that in some ways, the study and Spitzer's view of where the field should be heading kind of overlapped. They both believed that there were serious problems with psychiatric diagnosis. As you can see here from Bob Spitzer's conclusion, he says it outright. That's one way, that's one place that they overlap. And I think maybe in some ways, this study, which helped push the field to a kind of breaking point, could be a way to revalidate it. And I think it's kind of not a coincidence that in a few months after the publication of David Rosenhan's study, the APA put out kind of a hysterical response where they put together a meeting, an emergency meeting to talk about the state of psychiatry and what was going on with their kind of PR issues. And then a year after this, Spitzer was tapped as the chair of the new DSM-3. So, it's all happening at that same time. And Alan Francis, I hope it's okay that I'm using this Alan Francis because I haven't asked him, but in an interview with him, Alan Francis kind of lays it out in the role that this study played in the creation of the DSM-3.
And I think this was Spitzer's letter to Science, or whatever it was afterwards. To me, I think the study was brilliant and tremendously helpful. So I think that without the study, about the cross-national study on diagnosis that came out at the same time, without those two, Spitzer could never have done what he did with DSM-3.
Oh, I'm really glad you're saying that. Okay, great. Okay.
So I think it places some significance in what you're doing. This is not just another science study. It was a landmark study that shook. I described it in a couple of papers. It created a crisis of conscience in psychiatry.
So I think in a lot of ways, maybe the study was more useful alive than dead. And then that's conjecture, but that's kind of where I kind of landed. But the question still remained, how much of this study was real? At this point, I had so many questions. There were a lot of issues. Who were the other participants? And could they confirm some of this? Could they show me the way in some ways? He had described them in various ways. I don't need to, we're running out of time, so I don't need to play this. But after 6 years of searching, 6 whole years of searching, I found one who was involved in the original study, and his experience does conform very much to the written word. He did Thud Empty Hollow. He was in for 7 days. He kind of left on his own reconnaissance, but he did not receive a diagnosis of remission. I actually got his medical records, or what was left of it, and it said nothing about in remission. So that raised a red flag for me. But he was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia for a brief period of time at Agnew State Hospital. Then I find the person who I call the footnote. He is not one of the original 8, but he was a 9th pseudo patient whose data was removed from the study. And as you can see in the kind of far side of the screen, David Rosenhan claims that he falsified aspects of his personal history, including his marital status and parental relationships. He said he was unmarried. He said his parents were not living. Those are the 2 lies that he did. He said. Now, he too was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. He spent 19 days hospitalized at the U.S. Public Health Service. But that's where the similarities end. I'm going to play you an interview with him. Now, I'm over the top enthusiastic because I spent a long time trying to find people. So excuse my enthusiasm, but I'm going to play this a bit of his description of what it was like to be a patient.
And patients were welcome, as I say, in the nurses' station. There was room. There were guitar jam sessions.
Oh, really? Tell me about this.
Yeah, I'm almost feeling emotional as I talk about
it. Oh, wow.
Such a moving experience that, the level of caring, which, I conveyed in the article. I mean, the fact that, think about, this woman who had no money, no place to stay, is put up by a nurse in her own home.
Yeah, that was insane to me. And I mean, that is, I have to ask another question with down the line. I want to get back to that. But tell me about these guitar jam sessions. What was that about?
There was a young woman who was admitted who was really into music, and I think, she had some connection with the music scene in San Francisco and stuff, and there was a young guy who was a guitar player, and so she would sing, he would play the guitar.
Wow.
I mean, this is like,
wow.
They would play.
Did you know about
this? They would play, Peter, Paul, and Mary. They took trips to the ocean. It was an unlocked floor. He could really leave whatever he wanted, but he spent 19 days, and they actually told him that he was okay and he could go. He was an unhappy graduate student at Stanford at a very hyper-competitive place, and I think he felt it was a real healing experience, and I think he felt the other patients felt similarly. He believes that his data was not included, though interestingly, there was some of his anecdotes that were included in the study, including his hitting on a nurse at some point, even though David said he threw out the data. But he thinks that his data was not included because his kind of conclusion was that he was in a healing therapeutic environment that was helpful to him and that was helpful to the other patients. And that did not match David Rosenhan's thesis. So, I think that Dr. Niall Boyce, editor-in-chief of Atlantic Psychiatry, who I've talked to a lot about this, kind of puts it very beautifully. He says that I think that Rosenhan study got into the culture as an example of psychiatry's failings. And I'm not saying that psychiatry doesn't have failings, but we have to accurately identify what they are. And I think this is essential right now as we're heading into another mental health crisis. And what he did was he produced a document of doubtful veracity that polarized debate in a very unhelpful way by removing nuance. And the nuance and humility are the same sides of the coin. So, I think this is extremely oversimplistic, though I do want to play, I don't know if I have time, but I'm going to play just a little bit of David Rosenhan's take on hospitalization. It's so extreme, even though he knew that one of his pseudo patients, there were possibilities of creating therapeutic environments. This is what he said in an NPR interview.
Invent their own. Do you think that patients can get better going into institutions today as they are in this country?
No. They were not in any way therapeutic institutions. When you're treating people like lepers, when you can't affiliate with them, when you can't sit down and have a conversation with them, when your bathroom, if you will forgive me, is separate from theirs, and your eating facilities are separate from theirs, and your space is separate from theirs, in no way can you conceive that the half hour that.
So, I mean, essentially he's saying, no, these are not, and later on, just so I don't have time, he says, I think that they should be closed. I think that hospitals should be closed. Now, we, at this point, during this pandemic, we've seen hospitals close, and we're seeing hospitals close, and we're seeing people on the streets, people are very sick, and we're also seeing how many Americans don't actually view psychiatric hospitals the same way they view hospitals. And so this view and what this study did was contribute to that, to this separation between psychiatric conditions or the mind, brain, and the body. That is very harmful. And I'm putting this, I'm sure this is triggering for many psychiatrists. I know this was an article that really pissed a lot of psychiatrists off, but there's still this identity crisis, at least seen from outside in the field of psychiatry. And studies like Rosenhan's studies, which have endured and that are still taught in Psych 101 classes, that are still included in a majority of abnormal psychology textbooks. In fact, in the study of 12 abnormal psychology textbooks that had David Rosenhan's study in it, only 2 included any criticism. And I'm sure that the 2 that did included Robert Spitzer's response, but that's 2 out of 12. So Ken Kendler in 2016, again, the memorial lecture, I found that fascinating. And it was really heartening to hear his take on the DSM and how and Robert Spitzer's probable view of it as well as a working document. And so this is how he described the DSM, and he described how the field was so fraught at the time that the DSM was embraced as the Bible, and he described actually Spitzer Moses with his was Moses with his tablets, but that was not how Spitzer intended it to be. And so I'll let Dr. Ken Kendler describe.
Finally, this really suggests a humbler approach to our material. That's kind of the underlying theme. We should have a lot of pride about what DSM has done, but overselling it, which is one thing that constituents soon, in the long run, will not help. As Bob would have readily admitted, as I know him, some comment, he would have certainly admitted the entire DSM enterprise is just a rough approximation of a reality of psychiatric illness that remains largely to us. It is a solid and reasonable approach. There's a lot about it we can be proud of, claiming that we have developed definitive constituent descriptions of major psychiatric diagnoses should not be one of those claims.
So I return once more, and this is the end of the presentation. I'm sorry it's gone long, but I described how the best reporting tries to capture the most attainable version of the truth with clarity and humility about what we don't know. And I think that this applies to medicine. The best medicine, the best psychiatric care tries to capture the most attainable version of the truth, which is diagnosis, with clarity and humility about what we don't know. And I hope this study and all that surrounds it is a reminder of how far we've come in so many ways, but still how much we still have to learn. So I'm going to stop it here, and then we can open it up to questions. And I just want to thank you so. I'm so deeply grateful once more, especially to Janet and to Michael for inviting me to do this. It means a lot to me, and it's a real feather in my cap for my career to be here, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much, Susannah, for that presentation. It was really such a fascinating, sad and disturbing, such a fascinating story, though, and a real tribute to Bob Spitzer. I wanted to make one quick comment, and then I'll turn it over to the other panelists to start with questions. And my comment was just that I don't know if this was intentional or not, but you didn't mention one detail which is somewhat embarrassing for us, which is that Rosenhan actually got his PhD at Columbia.
Oh, I forgot that, yes.
So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff Lieberman and Michael first, see if they have questions.
Michael, go ahead.
So it's an interesting, when I read your book, I was most shocked by the fact that Bob had the records and could have blown the whole thing out of the water. That was unbelievable to me. It's really interesting. It's an interesting theory you have, that he thought it worked better not debunking the study and sort of allowing the controversy to, help really move psychiatry in the direction that Bob wanted. So I just want to thank you. It was a fabulous presentation.
Well, I have to ask you, do you think that's fair? Because you knew him so well. Do you think, am I being uncharitable, or do you think that's?
I'm shocked. The Bob I know, I would have thought he would have been more than happy to splash out how this whole thing was a fraud. So I find it baffling. So that's why your theory sounds good to me, because I can't come up with another one.
And honestly, it was baffling to me too, because I had interviewed you, I had interviewed Janet, I had interviewed other people who knew him, and it in some ways doesn't square, because he is a truth seeker. So maybe there was something else. Maybe the superintendent appealed to him in some way and made some kind of sense to him that I don't have access to. But again, what I don't know, I can't say that I know. So that it's just a theory in terms of.
Jonathan, you want to take the questions that are in the Q&A? So I'll read it. So, there's one from Gaurav Patel. Over the years, there also seems to have been at least historic rivalry between psychology and psychiatry. You think that has continued, and how has that played into the continued promulgation of this significantly flawed study?
I think that's absolutely true. I think everyone here can probably speak to that more deeply than I can, but there does seem to be on both sides a kind of like, let's get him, let's get them. I don't know why there is that rivalry. I would love to hear some thoughts as to why there is a rivalry there. And actually, yeah, does anyone want to weigh in on that? Because I'd find that really interesting.
I'll quickly respond to that, Susannah. It really comes down to market share and control. Psychiatry, by virtue of people having medical degrees, and would seem to sort of outrank other disciplines, but during the Freudian era, they ceded control of what was really the bastion of mental health care, asylums or large mental hospitals, to non-medical professionals.
What's interesting, Freud actually only allowed psychiatrists to practice psychoanalysis. So it seems it must have happened when kind of Freud became watered down into I don't know, because wasn't it required for
psychiatrists in the 19th century were nicknamed alienists because they presided over institutions that were outside of mainstream society and self-contained, and psychoanalysis gave psychiatrists a way to move from these kind of self-contained, kind of gloomy, dreary facilities back to Holly Street, and have practices focused on the worried well that could pay generous fees, and they ceded control of community psychiatry, in a sense, public psychiatry, and then when their credibility was really eroded by everything you described, it became a free-for-all for how people were going to be treated and who had what roles and what services were provided. And there was no clear scientific basis which justified, one discipline over another. So if you ask a person on the street, what do you go to if you have a problem? You're anxious, you're depressed, you're obsessive. They could say anything from a new age person, a yoga therapist, a clergyman, to a psychiatrist, psychologist, and social worker.
That's great.
So I wanted to ask another question. One of the things that surprised me is that, given how prominent this study was, I would have expected that the pseudo patients would have been very easy to find, that they would have come forward and talked about their experiences. Could you describe what made that so difficult?
Yes, I didn't make this clear. I guess I must there's some part of me that doesn't want to make this clear because I feel like I'm grappling with it. And I've experienced this before in terms of talking about it. I don't believe the other pseudo patients exist. I spent 6 years. I hired a private investigator. I myself am a reporter. put a lot of like gumshoe reporting into this, and I found one other one, and I found a footnote, and they were both graduate students at Stanford. So at that time, he was supposed to be almost done with the study because he was recruited over during 1969. He went into Hartford State Hospital. He went over to Stanford, I think in 1970. He became a kind of a guest lecturer there, and then went into a tenure track position. He handed in the first draft in 1971. I have those letters. So it was a very kind of a quick turnaround in those two pseudo patients. Now, I could find no evidence of anyone else, and the descriptions are odd. You know, at one point he describes one of the pseudo patients as a famous abstract female artist, to the point where her internationally known in, I think he names like the Met as one of the places. I mean, this is an extremely small amount of women who were making abstract art in 1970. So I went down a Grace Hardigan rabbit hole, Anne Harrington, or like all these famous, abstract artists from the 1950s to the 1970s of women. And there was like, a short list of 12. I went through all of them, and I really thought Grace Hardigan was it. And I eventually tracked down her archives. There was absolutely no way that it was her. But it was, all these strange coincidences happening. Grace Hardigan's husband actually was very obsessed with the common cold virus, interesting now with coronavirus, but he actually got encephalitis because he injected himself with something, some kind of, I can't remember exactly what it was, but he got encephalitis from it, never recovered, was fired from Johns Hopkins, and actually pretended to go to work for years. Anyway, aside, nothing to do with any of this, but I would go down these rabbit holes thinking I had these people, and I didn't have them. And I think, a few people have reached out to me subsequently with other stories of David stealing work from graduate students, or, being a little bit loose with facts. So I didn't want to believe it for a long time, and I did a lot to try not to believe it. And I didn't want to ruin someone's reputation and legacy without doing the hard work and trying not to, so I don't think that the rest of them existed. I don't.
Susannah, did you ask Science to do a retraction?
It's so funny. Dominic Sisti at UPenn, who's an ethicist, he and a few ethics scholars do want to do that. I feel conflicted about at this point having a retraction. It seems like too little, too late. Like the effect has happened, and to retract it at this point, I don't know how I feel about it. For some reason, I feel.
I mean, obviously, I'm biased, but I think it's important to do that. I had an experience. I'm on the New England Journal editorial board, and the Mediterranean diet had been established as really a cornerstone of nutritional control of cardiovascular disease, and it came to light by dint of a question from a obscure British anesthesiologist, something about the study that led to the journal to try and respond to it and to look at some of the data, which led to something else, which led to something else. And the whole thing began to unravel. And after a year of analysis, or 2 years, of determining how to do it, they had to completely reframe the results of the study in order to communicate really the more truthful presentation of the data. And it isn't to say that psychiatry should be exonerated for whatever past problems that engendered the massive criticism they experienced at that time. But right now the diagnosis continues to be a real lightning rod or third rail issue. We witnessed the launch of DSM-5, a controversy with Tom Insel and RDoc. Michael First can tell you chapter and verse about that. So I think it is worthwhile, and you would be a good person to initiate that. You and Michael and Ken Kendler. So right now the DSM is the custodian of the DSM is not the APA per se. It's an advisory committee that's chaired by Paul Applebaum, co-chaired by Ken Kendler and Ellen Liebenluft, that Michael is on, and several other people who are kind of the arbiters of when research reveals things that lead to the need to make modifications.
And actually, Paul Applebaum and Ken Kendler are in the book, so they're both extremely helpful. So, Yeah, no, that's great.
Susannah, a great talk. I have another question. How do you place this work that you've done by sort of uncovering this myth in the larger context that some of the other sort of seminal works of that same time period have also become more controversial over the years, like Philip Zimbardo with the Stanford experiment, of course, the Robbers Cave, Muzafer Sharif, that you wrote a comment on the recent edition of that book. It seems like in this whole era where some of these seminal works came out, a lot of that work has sort of come undone. So how do you think about it in the larger context?
Wow. I mean, you add the marshmallow study to that as well. There's
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, it was, I think in a lot of ways, I mean, pre-IRB, it was kind of freewheeling time. So contextually, like it was a lot looser. The problem is there were real world ramifications, right? I mean, we had real world ramifications from Zimbardo's study in a prison system.
Exactly.
Real world ramifications from the marshmallow study in the school system and education system. So, how do I place it in? I think that it's important to unveil that history because it's still affecting us in the present moment. So I'm hoping that this becomes part of that greater discussion. So we can kind of look at, okay, what were these kind of truths that we thought were self-evident that may not be? And what this kind of these accepted ideas, so how much of accepted dogma doesn't stand up, doesn't hold up, So I think it's always good in medicine and in the world in general to constantly be asking these questions and to look at how we got to the place we are today.
So there's a bunch of additional questions, but we are just about out of time.
I'm sorry, but
no, it was terrific. It was terrific. We really appreciate hearing from you. One quick comment. I'll just say that there's several comments in the Q&A function encouraging you to seek retraction from Science about this article.
I have to get over that feeling of, I don't know, the thing is I got to know David Rosenhan's family very, very well during the course of writing the book. I spent 6 years on it and I'm very close, not very close, but I'm friendly with his son. I'm very, very close with his friend who gave me who was the one who actually was the first one to say, I think he made some of this up because she knew him very well. He was a storyteller. But I have this kind of mixed feeling. I know I shouldn't, it's not objective, but I was enmeshed in his life and I got to like him actually in terms of his writing. And so part of me feels very conflicted. Is that strange? I don't know. But I think you're right. I think that at least have an asterisk in terms of the way that I want to make sure that in classrooms around the country, essentially, that's really where the power is in the study now. It's in sociology departments, it's in social work school. It's, that's where I want to make sure that now I don't want two of the abnormal psychology textbooks to have criticisms. I want all of them. That's really to me more than a retraction. I hope that we change the way we teach it and we use it as a kind of teachable moment, to lack of a better phrase. But really, I mean, it really allows us to talk about some issues of fraud. The idea, the questions of like what we accept as valid in the past that we should think. I think how we collect data. I think that it raises some serious ethical issues that are worthwhile to learn and to discuss. So I'm hoping that it creates that environment, not that it just, if it's retracted and just erased, I think that's doing it a disservice because I do think it's already had such an effect.
Yeah, so let me just comment on that and not be taking us too much over time. You're right, that it shouldn't be retracted, and the Mediterranean diet study wasn't retracted. The journal spent 2 years reanalyzing the data so it could print a revised version of it. So it's not that it's erased from memory. It wasn't, in reality, this was fabrication. But on the other hand, it may serve a historical purpose and so forth. And clearly, even if it was fabricated in some way, the intent of the criticism was not unwarranted because the diagnostic system was highly fallible. So I do think it concerns, but the reality is every, especially in medicine, is potentially able to be fooled. If you the example I guess that Bob used was if you go into an emergency room and you induce vomiting and you have ingested some coffee grounds before or something like that, you'll be worked up for having some type of either ulcer or GI bleed or something. So psychiatry is just, really easy pickings for someone who wants to expose it. And apart from whatever sociopathic inclinations he may have had, there was also the ideological tension between the disciplines. And, it's, remember your first quote from the journalist about, humbly seeking the truth. This is a way to refract it, not eliminate it, but, make it more truthful.
Definitely. Right. Well, yeah.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
If the way I would say, and if someone wants to do their retraction, in some ways I feel very like it is a feather in my cap that I would get a paper like that retracted. But it would be great if there was kind of an asterisk with it. Like, don't take this seriously. And here's all the, issues with the study. And so then it would foster those discussions. That would be my dream, I think.
Well, thank you again for that really fascinating talk. So appreciate you taking the time. And I think we'll stop there. And for everyone, we are taking a break next week for ACNP. And then the week after that, we'll be hearing from Dr. Colleen Berry. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you.